All right, as we continue tonight, I just want to say, I appreciate so much the generosity and the hospitality of everyone here. It has been great to be here, and I have just thoroughly enjoyed myself. Danny has been just a wonderful friend and host through all this, and I appreciate him so much and what he's doing here. I know that you all appreciate him and Jessica and their family and what they're doing here in serving God. It's just great to be with you all, and so thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to leave at some point and not have tried to make some effort to express how much I appreciate you all and this opportunity that we have to be together. I am trying to cover probably more than I can in this session, and so I want to just kind of jump right in and talk about the second, in our second session, the third element of what we talked about earlier. Remember, the government's a prop, so that's pray, respect, obey, and pay, and right now we're going to talk about obedience. Obedience to the government. And probably one of the best passages on that is Romans 13, verses 1 through 5. And in that passage it says this: "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience." And so in those 5 verses, the emphasis and the point is this: obey the government. The word that's used there repeatedly in terms of being subject to the government, the Greek word that's used there is hupotasso. And that comes from, that's 2 Greek root words that comes from. Hupo means under, and tasso means to line up. It literally means to line up under. That's a military term, this Greek term that's used here in this passage in Romans 13, 1 through 5, repeatedly. In other words, when the military calls out its soldiers, they are called out and they hupotasso. They line up under the one in command. And what do you do when you line up under the one in command? You do what the one in command asks you to do. And that's the term that's used to talk about our relationship to the government. We're called to obey the government. And let me remind you again of passages like Daniel 4, verse 17, that talk about how the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he wills, and sets over it the lowliest of men. That's not a recent thing. That's been the case for years and centuries. That the lowliest of men, he says. In other words, don't expect the greatest caliber of people to be your political leaders. You should want that. You should hope for that. Do everything you can to get people in positions that'll do a good job. But I think we would have to admit, generally speaking, for the most part, political leaders tend to often not be the best moral people. And God himself describes these people in Daniel 4:17 as the people that God sets up and God puts them there. And he describes them as the lowliest of men. And again, I don't get it. I don't always understand it. But that's what God's done. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9 talks about how his ways are not my ways and his thoughts are not my thoughts. There's a lot of things about God I'll never understand. I don't understand the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit and how 3 can be 1 and 1 can be 3. There's a lot of things about the nature of God and his eternality. I don't understand that because I'm a finite person. I know on this side of eternity I'll never understand what an infinite God means. How can you not have a beginning? Everything that I know in my lifetime has a beginning, but not God. There's just some things about God that I will never understand. In 1 Peter 2, in verses 13 through 14, it says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good." I appreciated the prayer earlier that mentioned federal and state and local and community and county leaders. There's different levels and layers of leaders, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the idea here is, okay, there's lots of different layers and types of governmental leaders. And don't presume from Romans 13, 1 through 5, that we're just talking about the supreme leader and you just have to obey him and everyone else you can ignore. If it's the government and if they're an authority, whatever level it is, God says, I want my children, I want you, I want Christians to be subject to the government. Whether it's the highest form of government or it's the lowest local form of government, he says, you hupotasso. You subject yourself. You get in line under the government. You obey them. Now, we're good at this, finding exceptions, right? And there is actually an exception here. There's an exception to this rule. Acts 5, verse 29. You remember that story, that occasion, where the apostles were told, don't preach anymore in the name of Jesus. And they came back and they gave this response and this statement and this principle, which has always been true. But it's explicitly stated here, we ought to obey God rather than men. In other words, there will be occasions when what the government asks you to do or commands you to do or permits you to do may directly conflict with what God does or doesn't want you to do. And in those cases in which a direct conflict arises, then you're going to have to make a decision. And what the apostles were saying and what God is saying is, and you need to make the right decision. And there are times, there's exceptions, it's rare, but it does happen, where we have to obey God rather than men. So, what, just by way of example, what if the government says, throw your baby in the river, like you find in Exodus? Okay, well, then the response should be, we ought to obey God rather than men. I can't do that, and that's wrong. The government, the king, the pharaoh, whoever it is that's in charge, if you tell me that's what I have to do, I can't do that. I am going to have to disobey the government because I ought to obey God rather than men. What about if someone said, stop preaching the gospel, like the Jews did on multiple occasions when they threatened the apostles? And we just read that specific account in Acts chapter 5. We ought to obey God rather than men. I can't obey. Now, in this case, it was local government. They said, we can't obey that. What if there's a law that prohibits us from teaching on marriage and divorce and sexual sin, and the government says that's now hate speech? We're getting there. What if the government says you can't do that anymore because we deem that to be hate speech? If you just quote Scripture from Romans chapter 1, we will call that hate speech, and there will be fines and penalties, and we might even throw people in prison. Well, we have to obey God rather than man, right? Now, just by way of example, and this is not as strange as it used to sound pre-COVID, but what if there's a law that says 10 or more people cannot assemble within 100 feet of a government building? And we say, well, we want to assemble and we want to get together and we want to pray, in front of the state capitol, and so we want to do that. Okay. Can I be faithful to God and can I keep that law, that human law, at the same time? Do I have to pray within 100 feet of that government? Now, I know the reason why someone would say I have to do it, because the government said you can't do it. And just like a parent who says, hey, congratulations, happy birthday, here's a electric race car track set. Now, whatever you do, don't lick the race car track set. And the kid's thinking, why would I lick the race car track set? I mean, I don't even want to do it. Until now. And then when a hole pops in my tongue from the electricity when I lick the race car track set, I finally realized why. I didn't want to do it until they told me I couldn't do it. I really didn't want to pray within 100 feet of this government building until they said I couldn't do it. Do I have to pray within 100 feet of government? Can I pray someplace else? Yes, I can. So I can be faithful to God and do what He wants me to do and pray without ceasing, but I don't have to do it within 100 feet of that building. I can keep that law as well. I don't have to create a conflict, is the point I'm trying to make. Or, what if there's a law that says Christians cannot assemble at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning? You say, well, we meet at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. And that's the time we've always met. Okay. Could you meet at 11? Could you meet at 9? Again, we don't have to create a conflict if there's a way to work around it. We might meet at 10 o'clock. Okay, the government doesn't want us to meet at 10 o'clock. Can we meet at a different time? Yeah, we can do that. The Bible does not tell us you have to meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, even though that's the way we've done it for years and years and years. And that's great. That's fine. We meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning in Katy, and I plan on doing that hopefully for years and years to come. But I don't have to create a conflict when one is not necessarily required. Now, I know some people like conflict, and they're looking for conflict, and they want to create conflict. That's not me, and that's not the way Christians should think. If there's a way that we can comply with what the government says and do what God wants us to do, that's what we're looking for. A Christian is to be a good citizen until being a good citizen makes me a bad Christian. That's the idea of we ought to obey God rather than man. Yes, we should obey the government, but not until the point that it requires me to disobey God. So, let me give you an example. And by the way, I like using examples from the Old Testament that deal with government, especially during periods of slavery when the Jews were persecuted by other nations, because there's a lot to be gained by looking at their relationship with the government during those very difficult times. And here's an example. You have, you guys remember Queen Vashti and King Ahasuerus, if that's how you pronounce his name. I'm sure I'll get to heaven someday and find out I've been mispronouncing it all my life. But remember, he commanded his queen, Vashti, to present herself before the attendants at his party because she was lovely to look at. We read in Esther chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. And she had, at least in her mind and spirit, a concept of modesty. And she was not going to display her body for her husband's friends. And so she had the mindset and refused in verse 12 to do what the king commanded her to do, because her mindset was, I ought to obey God rather than men. She chose modesty over sin. Now, here's another example. Remember Esther. We talked about this earlier, how she wanted to plead. And she did in this essence. And she knew that to plead and to go before the king, she'd be breaking the law. But remember how she did it. She actually broke the law. She wasn't supposed to be there. Now, the king could extend grace to her and extend his scepter. So here she chose to obey God rather than man. She said, I've got to do this. I'm willing to break the law because I'm trying to save my people. It's the right thing to do, even if it does involve me breaking the law. But again, remember how she did it, how she dressed, how she presented herself, how she stood quietly, how she waited to be recognized, how she reached out and touched the scepter. She showed great respect, like we talked about earlier, but she understood, I have to disobey the government in order to obey God, but it's the right thing to do. Now, just generally speaking, in every situation in the Bible where you see someone who's in this rare situation where they have to obey God rather than man, notice that, at least in my mind, in all the instances I can think of, God's children never showed disrespect for the government. You think about the apostles when they were dragged before certain tribunals and Jewish councils. You think about Paul when he's before Festus and Agrippa. You think about Christians who were persecuted in the early centuries, and they showed respect and restraint and humility in the way they conducted themselves. They were just a model of how I would hope I would act under very difficult circumstances. For instance, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. They didn't say, we're not bowing down to your false god, now deal with it. That wasn't their attitude. Now, they could have said that, and that would be the right thing to do, but they showed respect for the government. Even a government that they were having to disobey, they still were respectful in the way that they handled that situation. Every time. Daniel didn't say, I'm praying and there's nothing you can do about it. Take me to the lions. He just opened up his window and he prayed like he'd always prayed. On those rare occasions when we find ourselves in a situation where we have to obey God rather than man, we want to have that kind of attitude, mindset, that's so important that we're commanded to have to show respect for a government, even a government that we may have to disobey. Ezra and Nehemiah were called to bring about restoration. In Ezra 7 and verses 1 through 6, on that particular occasion, Ezra was called to restore the law of the Lord. But before returning back to Jerusalem, he obtained permission from King Artaxerxes. And now, similarly, 5 months after hearing about the condition of the wall of Jerusalem, Nehemiah wants to go back, and he wants to return back to Jerusalem to, again, bring about restoration, to build the wall. He knows that's the right thing to do, but in Nehemiah 2, verse 6, he gets permission from the king. Now, on both of those occasions, Ezra and Nehemiah could have said, here's the right thing to do. I'm going to do it. See you later, king. But they had the mindset, is there a way to do what God wants me to do? Return back to Jerusalem and bring back restoration. This is important. And it was. But can I do it in such a way that I don't have to violate the law? I'm a slave. I'm a prisoner here. Maybe I should ask for permission before I leave. And they did. And the king said, yes, you can return. In other words, if there's a way to do it, we want to try to obey the government and obey God. We don't want to create conflicts unless we absolutely have to. They did the right thing. So, how do they behave? With great respect. Now, here's the question I've got. And I had a discussion with a friend of mine recently, and he said, Kevin, I want you to talk about this when you go to Missouri, because I think this would be helpful. I hope so, because this was the question that he had, and maybe you've thought about this before. Okay, but what if the government passes a law, and I know in my mind this it's wrong? This is unconstitutional, it's improper, there's something wrong with it, and so So do I have to obey that law? Because at some point in time, it might get appealed up and some higher court will say, yeah, that's wrong. And so I was justified the whole time in not following this law because they passed something that I just knew was wrong. Do I have to obey a law that ultimately some court will later say was improper? That was his question. Because you'll hear about that from time to time. Some court, some higher court will say, yeah, that law's wrong. They can't do that. That was improper. That was unconstitutional. And so this is the explanation I gave to him, and I hope this helps. We're going to do a little civics here, okay? So if you need to just check out and leave at this point, but I think this might help a little bit in terms of our understanding of how the law works and how it relates to us. The supreme law of the land in the United States is the U.S. Constitution. And what I really like about that is the fact that it's really hard to change because it's the supreme law. And so underneath that, we have our three branches of government. And we've got the judicial, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. I think that because of some holdings like Marbury versus Madison, that the judicial branch is actually the most powerful branch, but that's another topic for another day. But there's this checks and balances in the government. And then you've got the legislative branch, they make laws or statutes, we might call them. The executive branch is supposed to enforce those laws, even though we know that presidents and governors and mayors sometimes they'll make their own laws, and there's a constitutional issue there in terms of separation of powers. Should they be making laws? I thought the executive branch was just supposed to enforce the laws. You're right, that's the way it is supposed to work. But generally speaking, they're supposed to enforce laws, and then you've got the judicial branch, and they're in charge of sort of interpreting the laws, but they also sometimes will do what we call create laws. There's a thing called the common law, which is sometimes they'll interpret the law, and sometimes they'll fill in the gaps where maybe the law doesn't say something. And like I said, that gives them a lot of power in what they're doing, because when they issue an opinion from a judicial higher court, that becomes the law. That's the equivalent of the law. Just like a statute that's passed by the legislature, and it's binding on us. And then there's us down at the bottom, the citizens. It should be a bigger box because there's a whole lot more of us. But that's us. Okay, now, let's talk about the legislative branch for just a second. Here's how it works out. You've got federal and state, and there's other levels and layers. There's local, there's community, there's county, and we don't have time to get into all that, but it gets pretty granulated. But let's just talk about federal and state. On the state side, you have the state legislature that meets at your state capital, whatever state you happen to be in, and they create the laws in that state. On the federal side, you've got Congress, and they create federal statutes, and you're subject to all of them. You're subject to, now you're not subject to the laws of the state of Texas because you don't live there. I am. You're subject to the laws of the state that you live in. And maybe you're from this state, maybe you're from another state, but wherever you live, Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, Texas, wherever state you're in, you're subject to those laws, and on top of that, all the federal laws that apply to everyone in the United States. That's a lot of laws. I get it. Now, to make things even more complicated, you have agencies, federal and state, and they make all kinds of laws about food and about businesses and about transportation, and they basically fill in all the gaps of every law that you could think of that the federal and state government hasn't thought of. They make up all these very specific laws, and you're bound by them too. For instance, it's state and federal agencies that will say, you can't put a ditch this close to a certain kind of a business or a construction site or things like that. Just very, very specific, minute things, and that's what federal and state agencies do. They've got a lot of spare time on their hands, and that's what they do. And it's actually really important because it's a lot of stuff that the state and federal government just, they don't have time to deal with all that specific stuff. They delegate that responsibility to these agencies, and they do that. And they create these laws, and they are binding on us as well. Now, in the executive branch, you've got federal and state. So on the federal side, you've got the president and all federal law enforcement. On the state side, you've got governors and all law and state enforcement. And they're supposed to enforce the laws and make sure that whatever laws are being carried out. That's why the executive branch is over all the military services. They're over all of the police. Their responsibility is to make sure the laws are enforced and carried out. That's their job. Okay. Now, the judicial branch gets complicated. But just to simplify it, you've got federal and state. You've always got both of those. And on the federal side and on the state, here's how it works. You've got trial level courts. They're oftentimes called district courts. It's different in each state. Like New York is weird because it's just New York. And they call their trial level courts superior courts. It's like, well, isn't a superior court the highest court in the land? No. But that's what they call their trial courts. It's New York. But typically, most states call their trial level courts where you try cases where you have the judge with the gavel, and by the way, judges don't have gavels, but the judge with the gavel, and they try a case, and it's guilty or not guilty, or liable or not liable, and those kinds of things. That's at the district court level. And then oftentimes, at the end of that trial, somebody's happy. Oftentimes, it's the party that lost the lawsuit. And they want to go up to a higher court and said, the lower court did something wrong, and so the appellate court has to take that case. They have to take it. But if you don't like the outcome there, then on the state or federal side, you can go up one more level higher, and you can go up to a Supreme Court. Each state has a Supreme Court. There's a Supreme Court of Missouri. There's a Supreme Court of the United States in Washington, D.C. that you hear about in the news frequently. You can go to one of those courts if you're in a state or federal court, and you can go up to them, but they don't have to take your case. Those are discretionary courts. You have to convince them that your case is worth them listening to and taking it and looking at the issues on the merits and deciding whether or not they got the law right. And it has to be important because sometimes they'll just say, we're not interested. You got to get their attention. And so, but what happens is if a court says, okay, this particular statute is unconstitutional, then that's the law. Now, another court might change that ruling and say, no, you got that wrong. It's actually the other way around. And then that's the law. Wait, so the law's changing? That's exactly right. It can. And let me just give you an example here. So when a law is passed by the legislature or their administrative agency, that's what we call the law of the land. It's binding on us all. Those are laws that God says you have to obey those. The law can be repealed by the legislature, or a court can say, no, that's wrong. You can't have that statute, or we're going to restrict that statute because it oversteps the bounds of what is constitutionally allowed. And so they may change it, they may modify it, or they may strike it down. But whatever it is they say, that's the law. And whenever they come out with that opinion from that appellate court, that's what they issue. They issue opinions, and those opinions that are issued by the courts become the law of the case, and that becomes the law that applies to all of us. Now, if a court in Texas says something, that doesn't really impact you because that's Texas. But if the United States Supreme Court says something, that's all of us. And we're bound to follow those. So let me just give you an example here. So let's say a state legislature passes a law that says you cannot pray in public. I'm not talking about whether or not we should or should not obey it. I'm just talking about what is the law. This is one of those laws that you don't obey. But no one's going to pass this law. But let's say that's the law. Okay, well then that's the law in that state. You can't pray. Let's say that sounds like a California law, doesn't it? So let's say it's California. Okay, well then that's the law in California. In California, you can't pray. And that's the law they came up with, just like the law that Daniel had to deal with. Okay, now That's the law. But let's say that a state intermediate appellate court, just one level up from the trial level court, that court says, you know what, that's not right. That's unconstitutional. That violates the First Amendment. That violates the Free Exercise Clause, which says that Congress shall make no law infringing upon the free exercise of religion. And so they say, okay, so that's unconstitutional. Well, then, at that point, the law is, and you can pray in that state. Because that court, that state appellate court has said, that law's no good. It's unconstitutional. So now the law is, you can pray in that state again. But let's say the state Supreme Court says, no, it is constitutional. The intermediate appellate court got it wrong. We took this case and we say, no, that's perfectly fine. You can do that. And so the state Supreme Court says, the law's perfectly fine. So now what's the law in that state? Well, now the law's back to, you can't pray in that state again. But let's say, and you can't do this, you can appeal from a state Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, it's always a 5-4 decision, right? In a 5-4 decision, they say, the U.S. Supreme Court holds the law is unconstitutional. So what is the law in that state now? Now we're back to the law is you can pray in that state. So it kept changing back and forth. Well, what was the law? Well, the law is initially what the legislature passed. And then a court said, no, that's wrong. And a court said, no, that's right. And another court said, no, that's wrong. And yeah, it can go back and forth and it can change. Now, with this example, we would just say, well, I don't care what any of the courts say. We ought to obey God rather than men. That's right. But in other cases with other kinds of laws, like the one about meeting within 100 feet of a government building, well, what they say is the law. And then at some point, no, it's not the law. Then at another point, it is the law. And so whatever the law is, at whatever point in time we're looking at, God expects us to comply with that. Even if ultimately a court says, no, that law's wrong. Okay, but before you get there, I don't get to unilaterally decide for myself and just say, you know what, I know how this thing's going to turn out, and so I'm just going to start disobeying the government now because I know ultimately, no. When a court says what they say, they can create law at that time. And I'm expected to obey that law, even if ultimately it might get changed. Just like if the government says at one point in time, we're going back to prohibition, no drugs, no alcohol, no beer. Okay, then that's the law. Well, if they change it later, okay, then they can change it later. But what is it now? And what am I to comply with now? And that is what the law, the status of the law at that point in time. It could change from time to time. I know that gets complicated. That's why you hire important, wonderful, lovable, bald attorneys like myself to explain these things to you to make sure you're complying with the law. And the good news is, when I do things for churches and for other Christians, I charge a really high rate of $0 and 0 cents. And so it turns out to be a pretty good deal for everyone else. But I'm glad to help with those kinds of things. So now let's talk about paying taxes, something we all really enjoy. Paying taxes. Well, unfortunately, the Bible talks about that. Now let me just give you a real quick overview of why Jews hated paying taxes so much. Because here's kind of the structure of what they had to deal with. This is what they had. First of all, they had a poll tax. That was a tax you had to pay because you're alive. And so if you're alive at a point in time, the Roman government, and you're part of the Roman census, and they recognize you as being alive, you owe the government money just for being here, whether you wanted to be here or not. Then on top of that, you had income tax. Income tax was a flat 10% rate. You're thinking, well, that's not too bad. Well, then you had taxes for roads and harbors. You had an inheritance tax. You had a postage tax. You had an import tax. You had a ground or a land tax, which was 1/10 of all grain or proceeds from grain, and 1/5 of all wine or proceeds from wine. There was a fish tax that was based on two things: how many nets you used in fishing. Even if you didn't catch anything, you paid taxes. And then you also got taxed on the number of fish that you caught. And then there was a cart tax, which was based on if you had a cart it's used in your business, based on the number of wheels that you used on your cart for your business. I think that's when wheelbarrows got to be really popular. So you didn't have to pay as much in taxes. And then on top of that, you had the temple tax, like we read about in Matthew 17. And then whatever extra the tax collector could tax to supplement his own personal income, which is why tax collectors were hated so much, but they paid a lot of taxes. And I know we complain about our taxes, and it's a lot, and more than it should be. And we're all in agreement on that. But they paid an awful lot. And then in that context, with all of those taxes, here's what Paul writes by inspiration in Romans 13, verse 6. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. They're ministers of God. Does the government think they're a minister of God? Probably not. But that doesn't change the fact that they are. And God put them there, and so God says, pay taxes. Jesus himself paid taxes. In Matthew 22, remember Jesus was asked, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? You remember that. And Jesus said, show me a coin whose inscription's on it. And you knew that they already knew they were fighting a losing battle. They could see where that argument was going. And Jesus says, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And so pay your taxes. Not the ones that you think are fair or the ones you agree with. Just pay your taxes. I know sometimes we think, but the government does terrible things with my money and I shouldn't have to be forced to fund those things. I understand that. And the Bible says, pay your taxes. And I know why it's so hard. It's hard because it's my money and I earned it and I don't want to give it away to the government. I get it. I feel the exact same way. But the Bible still says, pay your taxes. But here's the thing in all of this. But the government is so bad. I mean, it just seems like, I know we always say it's bad and it's always been bad, but it just seems like it's worse than it's ever been. Just the things that our government is not just endorsing, but actively promoting. And it is bad. I mean, the government protects sinful sexual misconduct. You've got cases like Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized gay marriage. The next stage of sinful normalization that the government is getting behind is going to be pedophilia. Pedophiles are no longer to be called pedophiles anymore. They're now identified by the acronym MAP, which means a minor attracted person. It's insulting to call them pedophiles. They're minor attracted persons. We're starting to normalize that sin. We have disproportionate health statutes that infringe on our rights to assemble. We have governors and mayors, we had this happen in Houston, that will occasionally attempt to ban preaching on the sin of homosexuality, calling it hate speech. The government is not what we wish it would be. But I want you to think about this. The primary texts that we've been looking at to talk about the relationship of the Christian to the government, the primary texts have been Romans, 1 Timothy, and 1 Peter. In all three of those books, and you may not know, but just it's the same Roman Caesar for all three of those books. All these passages that talk about pay your taxes, obey the government, respect the government, pray for the government. All of those passages come. Guess who the Caesar was at that time? Nero. Nero. When it said honor the king or the emperor, depending upon your translation, that was talking specifically about Nero. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to think for just a moment with me about the first century world. That's a statue of what Nero looks like. Here's what the first century world looked like. Widows and orphans were neglected in society and they were irrelevant. Slavery was common. It's estimated that 1/2 to 1/3 of the Roman world were slaves. Caesar was the supreme leader and the final authority in all matters, so much to the extent that emperor worship was a normal thing. In Israel, you had Herod, who was the supreme leader of that area of the world, and he could pretty much do whatever he wanted, whether it's beheading God's prophets or killing babies. He could do what he wanted, and there was no consequence. Let's talk about Nero briefly, and I mean briefly because it's sordid and sad. 4 months after coming to reign, Nero fatally poisoned his half-brother Britannicus to secure his reign as the next Caesar. He would disguise himself going out at night with friends, drinking and visiting brothels. There were rumors that Nero had an incestuous relationship with his mother Agrippina, and eventually Nero murdered his mother. He murdered 2 of his wives. Nero would have sex parties at his villa where boys and girls were stripped of their clothes, and Nero would attack them and do whatever he wanted. A boy named Sporus, who resembled Nero's murdered mother, was castrated and paraded in public as Nero's companion. A fire devastated 10 of the 14 districts of Rome in AD 64, and when rumors circulated that Nero was responsible, which he was, Nero took advantage of this situation and this environment, and he blamed the Christians, allowing Nero to terribly persecute in the most horrific ways Christians. Nero would have Christians tortured. He would sew them in animal skins and throw them to wild animals to attack and kill them. He would have them whipped to death. He would have Christians crucified. He would have them covered in wax or pitch or tar and set them on fire to light his parties or his chariot races at night. Paul, who is the author of the text that we have been reading and directing us to obey and pray and have respect for government leaders, will eventually be, tradition holds, beheaded by Nero. If anyone had the right to say, well, yeah, you should pray and respect and obey and pay taxes to the government, but not if they're really bad. If anyone had the right to say that, it was Paul. In that world and in those circumstances. But there was no caveat. There was no exception. There was no asterisk. There was no footnote that said, unless they're really, really evil and bad. Whatever government you find yourself in, God says you pray for that government, you respect that government, you obey that government, you pay taxes to that government. But they're so evil and bad. I know. Do you really think we're worse than first century Rome? I mean, we're heading in that direction, but do you really think we're worse than that? God says, just please pray, respect, obey, and pay. Let me make one final point. I am all for voting for and electing people that I think will do the best job of conducting the affairs of the government in such a way that we can lead quiet and peaceful lives. I had someone talk to me earlier and say, there's a lot of people talking about, and Danny and I were talking about this when he picked me up about, there's people throwing out this, we're just picking the worst of, the lesser of two evils. And where should a Christian be involved in picking the lesser of two evils? And my answer is, you're asking the wrong question. And it's jaded and intentional. Government and options have always been less than perfect because we've been voting on human beings. And I don't know if you've noticed or not, but human beings tend to be imperfect. I'm not picking the lesser of two evils. I'm simply exercising the right that I have that some people don't have in the country that they live in, but I'm exercising my right to make a decision. Which leader do I think will do the best job of allowing me the liberties that I have to worship God, to be a Christian, to go to work, to not be harassed, to live a Christian life in a quiet and peaceful way? That's what I want for my government because that's what Paul said government's supposed to do. So I'm going to vote for someone. Please don't come away from this and saying, Kevin's saying we shouldn't have anything to do with the government. No, I'm thankful for people who are involved in government and make good decisions. Brother DeBerry from Tennessee has done wonderful things trying to work in and with the government as a state leader in Tennessee. I'm thankful for that. But my point is this. Most of us are not in that situation. Most of us are just that little brown box at the bottom. We're part of the citizenry. And as citizens, what does God want us to do? He wants us to pray for the government. He wants us to respect the government. He wants us to obey the government, pay our taxes. I know that sounds like a lot, and that's not easy. I agree. But we're not called to easy. I want a government that will hopefully do the best job that they can. But even if they don't, even if they turn on us and persecute us, that was the context of first century Christians in Paul's writing. Christianity was already under persecution. And in that context, he still said, you pray. Think about this. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. In other words, you don't give them a reason to say, oh, you Christians, I know how you are. I know you're just trying to start problems. You're just trying to start a rebellion. You're just secretly trying to get things where you can overthrow the government. That's what people said in the first century. He said, you don't give them a reason to have anything evil or bad to say about Christ and his followers. You be a model citizen. Unless the government requires you to do something sinful, then you've got to break away. But other than that, you be a good citizen. Even if you don't like it, and there's a lot of times when I don't like it. But that's okay. God calls us to be good citizens, but more importantly, faithful Christians. I'm from New Zealand. And when I go back to New Zealand, they've got the same political problems we have. They've got a prime minister who's a lesbian. They've got people who are doing sinful things in government, and the government is endorsing sinful things. And when I go over there and visit, I hear the same things, and they talk to me, and they go, the government's so bad, and it's doing all these terrible things. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, I get it, and that's terrible, but that's not me. That's not my country. I'm no longer a citizen of New Zealand. That's not my problem. My citizenship is over on the other side of the world. Do you see where I'm going with this? As a citizen of another country, why should I be concerned and tangled up in the politics in another country when my citizenship lies someplace else? I'm a citizen of heaven. I'm a part of the kingdom of God. That's the most important thing I have. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that politics are not important and we should never have anything to do with that, but not to the extent that it keeps me from being an effective servant of God. I don't want someone to say, I'm never going to listen to what you have to say because we disagreed on this political point. I'd rather have a friend that will listen to me when I'm trying to reach out to them and save their soul. It's so much more important than whatever political divisions we may have. I want to be like Paul, that I by all means may save some. That's the mindset we should have towards our government and towards our politics. I am thankful for the government that we have, as imperfect as it is. I'm thankful for the legal system that we have, as imperfect as it is. There are people all over the world literally risking their lives to get into this country because what we have here is so much better than what the rest of the world has. I am thankful and blessed. But there is nothing more valuable than the citizenship that we have in the kingdom of God. It will forever be important. On Judgment Day, God is not going to ask me, Kevin, were you a citizen of the United States or New Zealand? Were you a member of this political party or that political party? those issues are not going to come up. What matters is, was I faithful to God? Did I love God and love my neighbor? Did I help people get to heaven? That's what matters. Let's be citizens first and foremost in the most important kingdom that has ever been established. One that is true and one that will last. And we'll talk about that more tomorrow. What is true and what is lasting. We find that in God's kingdom. Okay. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask, especially given that complex civics lesson? We could talk later, and I could maybe try and explain some of that and make it less confusing. But anything that anybody wants to ask before we are dismissed. I am shocked. All right, go ahead. I'm listening. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is actually a question this time.
Okay, now I'm really ready.
Actually a question.
Yes.
Can I ask a question about taxes?
You want legal advice or? Okay.
Okay. So, there's been Christians, and I talk to my tax lady. There's been Christians that I've had say, well, you don't have to pay taxes on cash, or, you've been paid a check, you didn't get the 1099 for it, so you don't have to pay taxes on it. So, I'm a very conscientious person. If I owe taxes, I'm going to pay them.
Right.
So I got a hold of my tax lady. It's like, so, cash, do I have to pay taxes on cash? You hear Christians say, well, you don't have to pay taxes on cash. And she was like, well, I just kind of let people do whatever their conscience tells them to do. And I said, yeah, but what am I legally required to do?
Okay. So it sounds like, first of all, you need to get another tax person to consult with. And second of all, it reminds me of this great line that Tom Cruise has in this discussion in the movie The Firm that some of you may have seen. And he's dealing with the tax code, and he's asking, if we pay or don't pay taxes on this, does that violate the tax code? And the senior partner in the firm says, I don't care if it's illegal or illegal. All I care is, will we get caught? Okay, that's how some people think in terms of the government, whatever it is, whatever law it is, including the tax code. And again, that's not how a Christian should think. It's not, well, I'll do it and get away with it until I get caught, and then I'll pay the penalty and I'll do this or that. It's like, and that's fine. Yeah, you'll have to pay that penalty, and hopefully it won't be too severe, and hopefully you won't go to jail. But we should not think that way in terms of what can I get away with. There are legitimate, what we call loopholes in the tax code. There's certain things that you can pay and you can defer taxes and all that kind of stuff. Get a tax person who can help you with that, and I highly encourage you to do that, and that is not me, by the way. One of the reasons why I went to law school is because I didn't want to have to do math for the rest of my life. And a lot of my friends, it's the same reason. So find a good tax accountant, tax person. The accountants are, a good accountant really knows these tax codes, and these tax codes are just awful, terrible, thick, monstrous volumes of information, but they know that stuff. I've got an elder at Katy, and he's a tax accountant, and I trust him completely. He gives good tax advice. Find someone, follow their advice, and I'm all for that. But if you're getting advice of, well, if the tax advice starts turning into a Hallmark movie, just follow your heart. You might want to find someone who gives a little better, firm, solid, sound advice. All right. Thanks so much. If any of y'all do have some other specific questions, I'd be glad to talk to you about that. But thank you so much for being here, and thank you for tolerating the civics lesson. I hope that was helpful. Danny, what? Okay.